Charles Darwin. In 1831, Charles Darwin set sail on the HMS Beagle around the world. A lot of what Charles Darwin did, he was a scientist. He made observations and collected evidence. And as he was making his observations and collecting evidence, he used all of that to eventually, over a long period of time, propose a theory on evolution. This just didn't happen overnight. This took a really long time. One of the things that he did was he observed patterns about how well suited organisms were for a given area. Charles Darwin was the master of observing. He not only observed things firsthand, but he also listened to other scientists and read a lot of what other scientists learned as they went to new places and discovered things about the organisms there. The main place that ended up influencing Charles Darwin around his travels were the Galapagos Islands. One of the things that he saw were that the tortoise shells and even the beaks of some of the finches were unique to each island. Sometimes these observations that he made didn't necessarily strike him as being very important when he first saw it, but afterwards, as he was going through all of his notes, he came to see that there were some similarities and then there were some differences between the organisms on different islands. It didn't just all of a sudden jump out at him, no. So over time, Darwin came up with his theory on evolution, which we call the theory of natural selection. There were several parts to the theory. We'll go through each part individually. So the first part to his theory on natural selection was that there was a variety of organisms due to genetic differences. These genetic differences, or this variety, can be passed on to their offspring. Now, we've already talked about genetics. We know that genetic traits can be inherited. But one of the biggest things is that we know that our variety comes from a basis of our genes. We know that we can't inherit traits that we acquire in life. If I accidentally chop off my arm in a farming accident, it doesn't mean that all of my children that I have after I chop that arm off are only going to have one arm. We know that it has to be something that's genetically based. A couple of things that go along with this variety is the difference between selective breeding and natural selection. Selective breeding is exactly what it sounds like. We choose organisms with desirable traits, but it's not nature that's choosing these desirable traits. It's humans, in many cases, that are choosing the organisms with desirable traits. So in the case of breeding dogs, I may decide that I want to take a poodle and a Labrador and make a Labradoodle because the Labrador has a wonderful personality and the poodle tends to not shed as much. Now in selective breeding, we talked about this with genetics, I hope that it gets the traits that I want. They're not necessarily traits that are best for the organisms, but it's something I want. Artificial selection, nature doesn't select the desirable traits, but it's done by humans completely. So selective breeding and artificial selection kind of go hand in hand. Artificial selection is completely done by humans though, and it is not a natural thing. So nature isn't the one that's choosing those traits. The second part to Darwin's theory is basically dealing with something called overpopulation. Overpopulation is when organisms will produce more offspring than can survive in nature. Many of the ones that survive oftentimes don't even go on to reproduce. So there's a couple of examples that go along with this whole concept of overpopulation. Think of frogs and fish. Frogs and fish living in the water lay a lot of eggs. And one of the reasons why they lay a lot of eggs is because there's a high chance of death, loss, and damage along the way. They may have predators come along and eat the eggs. The eggs may get washed away in a storm or something of that nature. So they'll lay a lot of eggs. Some of them will survive, some of them will not, but the more eggs they lay, the better chance that some of them will survive. We also know that as time goes on, some of the organisms may not be able to reproduce. Maybe they die before they get a chance to reproduce. And that's our second example. Maybe they die due to illness. They may die because they got killed by a predator, and they may die due to starvation or something of that sort. Maybe a mate didn't choose them and they didn't reproduce. In many cases, some of the reasons why they don't go on to survive and reproduce is because they just weren't best in that environment. Maybe it was the slow one, maybe it was a hurt one, maybe it had some sort of genetic deformity, and we're talking about maybe a deer that couldn't run as fast away from a predator. Another thing thing that Darwin noticed and that he put into his theory of natural selection is about competition. We're going to be doing a lab on competition that deals with finches and beaks and feeding patterns. But competition is really a basic term that many of you are familiar with. And in terms of evolution, one of the things that we like to discuss is the fact that overproduction or overpopulation can lead to competition for our basic resources in life. So some of those resources that might cause us to compete would be food, shelter, habitat, mates, and I'm sure the list could go on that you might come up with. We call these things limited resources. If there's an area that has a very limited food supply and these organisms are competing for this one particular food source, we're going to have competition for it. Whoever the best competitor is that gets the most food is going to be the one that's going to live to survive and go on to reproduce. Competition can be minimalized or minimized if we do not share something called a niche. And a niche is really our role in the environment and how we interact with the living and non-living parts of our environment. So an example of how competition can be minimized with different organisms, we talk about birds nesting. Some birds may nest in different levels of a tree in order to avoid competing for space, that habitat or shelter in some cases. They may also limit themselves to the different parts of the tree so that they don't have to compete for where they're going to put their nest, and they don't have to compete for where they're getting their food from. Birds also may eat different seeds in order to reduce competition. They may have a great adaptation with their beak that will help them to open a different kind of seed that another bird can't. So competition is something that we know is very natural, and we know that competition exists all of the time, and we can hopefully reduce that competition. If the competition isn't reduced, then some organisms may be forced to go to a different area, find a new environment, or they may die off. The last main point of natural selection that Darwin came up with are these concepts of adaptations. And an adaptation is a trait that allows for a greater chance of survival. An organism is considered to be best suited for their environment if they survive and reproduce most successfully. So the organism that gets the most food, the organism that can best compete for the shelter, compete for a mate, is going to be the one that's going to survive and then move on to be able to reproduce. In the case of an adaptation, we are going to pass our heritable traits, so these genetic traits, onto our offspring and increase the frequency of these favorable traits over time. If it's a trait that doesn't allow us to survive and reproduce and maybe hinders us instead, you would think that that trait wouldn't be super high in frequency in a population because it would be causing these organisms to die off. So you would expect in a population that the traits that make you more able to survive, better able to compete for your basic resources like food and shelter and mates, will be the ones that will get passed on to your offspring because you were the one that were able to reproduce and pass your traits on. We talked about this example during the genetics unit, and I think it's kind of important to pass on to relate back to this concept. So one of the things we talked about were peppered moths. And back in Europe during the Industrial Revolution, originally it was the gray moth that was high frequency numbers in the population because they tended to blend in with the bark. But unfortunately, after the Industrial Revolution, with all the pollution and the soot that got on the trees, that gray moth decreased in frequency because it no longer blended in with the environment. The black moth numbers increased in frequency because now they were better to blend in with their environment, so their numbers increased. So it turned out that the environment basically forced these changes to occur because our gray moth no longer was able to hide and camouflage themselves against the trees. So they didn't survive, they didn't pass on that trait to their offspring. The black moths survived, passed on that trait to their offspring, and which is why they increased in their numbers. So we'll do a quick little kind of summary of natural selection. So overall, with natural selection, we know that species are diverse due to various environmental pressures and genetic traits. They descend from a common ancestor and are modified over time. Evolution, we know, doesn't take place just overnight. It's something that happens over long periods of time usually, And we know that those changes occur because of different environmental pressures. We're competing for all sorts of limited resources. A natural disaster may come along, change a food source on us, wipe an entire food source out, wipe out an entire habitat. The organisms that have the adaptations that allow them to survive in the environment are going to live, and they are going to be able to move on to reproduce and hopefully pass on those traits to their offspring. There's a couple of questions that may come to mind. How did life actually begin? We weren't around when life began, but there are some questions that people still have about how did it begin and how did we end up with such diverse populations of organisms? What did that first organism look like, and how did we get to be so diverse with so many millions of different kinds of species on Earth from maybe just one common ancestor? We don't really have a lot of proof that it was one common ancestor, but we do know that we do have some common ancestors, and now we have evolved over time to become more diverse. And why do species truly go extinct? Why is it that some species don't have adaptations to allow them to survive an environment? Why did the dinosaurs become extinct? Why is there no more woolly mammoths or saber-tooths on Earth? What really truly happened to these organisms? These are still questions that scientists have and are still trying to answer as time goes on.